from me and welcome back to my series on the historical Jesus. Last time I reviewed the history and contradictory versions of the mythical Jesus theory, and now we're going to return to an examination of the evidence and put the historical Jesus theory to the test again. In the very first video of this series, I demonstrated how the historical Jesus theory could be applied to both Aramaic and Greek texts to help historians sift between the stories that could be linked to an historical person of Jesus and the ones that definitely can't. But the historical Jesus theory does not only help us understand things at the textual level, it is also consistent with and helps make sense of trends in early Christian beliefs over the first 2 centuries in the Jesus movement. A quick errata, I said in the last video that in this one we were going to look at 200 years worth of theological development. I misspoke. I meant to say the first 2 centuries of the Common Era, but even that was a little overambitious because I realized I can't cover all the theologies about Jesus in a single video. Instead, we're going to focus on the Gospel writers and Paul, and later on we'll examine heresies as well. But for today, let's focus on the writings most people are familiar with and examine how the historical Jesus theory maps onto the evidence, starting with the original theology, the one that was preached before even Paul's conversion. In each video, I try to present some specific challenges to mythicists, and so before we get started, here is the challenge I am issuing them in this video. Is your theory able to account for the observed changes in what people believed about Jesus from 30 to 180 of the Common Era? Let me give you an overview of the theological timeline here, and then we'll go into more depth. I previewed this in the last video. It's the evidence to be explained. And mythicists, you should feel free to take a screenshot and use earlychristianwritings.com, which is a fantastic, if sometimes slightly dated, resource for scholarship on Christian writings. What are we looking at here? Well, several things I will cover over the course of the series, but for this one, we're only going to focus on documenting what the Christian writings say about when Jesus became the Messiah or the Son of God. If, instead of attacking the writing, we actually read them and try to understand them, interesting things happen. Every gospel author has his own take, and he is writing for his own community. To really understand what different people over the decades thought about Jesus, we have to understand these authors. If you take the time to do that, a pattern of increasing complexity and sophistication can be observed. You can also observe that none of the gospel writers agree with each other about Jesus' nature. Jesus' nature starts out completely human, a man who serves the Jewish God, and eventually believers develop this theology that puts him on par with that God, which is a pretty awesome promotion, really. The first 2 boxes here are the same color because they advance adoptionism, the theological view that Jesus was a human who was adopted by God to be his son, either at his resurrection or his baptism or his ascension. This is the earliest view of Jesus that we have from his followers. They were teaching that he was an ordinary man who had been adopted by the Jewish God. And I have the texts to prove it. As always, a big shout out to Professor Bart Ehrman for his scholarship in this area, and the information in this video comes primarily from his books Did Jesus Exist and How Did Jesus Become God? In chronological order, the pre-Pauline writings, passages that quote from material that predates Paul's first writings in the 50s, show us that the first theology preached by the Jewish followers of Jesus is that after his death, he was exalted by and adopted by their God at the time of his resurrection to be his Messiah. The next author we have is Paul, who wrote from the 50s until the 60s of the Common Era. Paul believed that Jesus was a sort of super angel, a sort of divinish being who wanted to serve God so perfectly that he became a human being, served him perfectly, and then to say thanks, God made Jesus the Jared Kushner to his Donald Trump, the name praised above all others except himself. Mark also has an adoptionist view of Jesus, but he alters the timeline as to when that happened. According to the author of Mark, Jesus was a human adopted by Yahweh to be his Messiah when Jesus was baptized. But by the time we get to the authors of Luke and Matthew, who are writing their Gospels between 80 and 100 of the Common Era, Jesus' pure humanity had been mixed with a divine nature. In their stories, Jesus was created by God at the time of his conception. Similar to pagan beliefs, Jesus was the product of a divine being impregnating a human woman, but in this case without the messy act of sexual intercourse. Yahweh might have walked in the cool of the day back in the times of Genesis, but there was no way that the Jewish God would be involved in anything so bodily as bumping uglies. The last theology can be found in the Gospel of John. The author of John has Jesus co-eternal with Yahweh from the start. Jesus is the Logos, which itself is a Greek word, and the Jesus of John practically floats on air while he goes about his life, giving speeches in very, very well-constructed Greek. If we reconceptualize theology as a ladder, we can see that the later in time we go, the more fantastical people's beliefs about Jesus were, but the closer in time we go to the events, the more human and ordinary Jesus is. Most Westerners will be familiar with the birth stories of Matthew and Luke, and they are probably aware that Jesus is called Logos in John. But since most people are unaware of the theology from before Paul's letters, the pre-Pauline traditions, or the theological Jesus of Mark, let's spend more time with those. We're going to look at more linguistic fossils in the Greek text, but this time they're not in Aramaic. However, they do stand out like a sore thumb in terms of their theology. The consistent pattern in these remnants is that they discuss Jesus becoming the Messiah at his resurrection. And by the way, this section about Jesus becoming the Messiah is primarily from How Did Jesus Become God, pages 216 to 35. The earliest theology we can observe in the text is that Jesus was an ordinary man who became the Messiah at his resurrection. Before the Gospels were written down, there were stories in circulation among believers about Jesus, statements of faith about his lineage, his actions, and there were prayers created by the early Jesus movement to bond with one another. We know these ritual sayings and prayers were part of the Jesus community because the authors who later wrote down the quotes are communicating ideas that contradict their own theology. We'll see this in the writing of Paul and the author of Luke and Acts. For an example, let's look at the passage written by Paul in Romans 1:1 and also in 3:4. This letter is typically dated to 57 of the Common Era, so this is within, 20 to 25 years of Jesus' execution, according to the theory we're looking at. Here is the relevant extract. Paul, a servant of Jesus Christ, called to be an apostle, concerning his Son, who was born of the seed of David, according to the flesh, who is declared to be the Son of God with power, according to the Spirit of holiness by the resurrection from the dead, even Jesus Christ our Lord. The key passage that Paul quotes, who was declared to be the Son of God with power, according to the Spirit of holiness by the resurrection from the dead, is evidence of an earlier statement of faith from the followers of Jesus, who thought he had become the Messiah at his resurrection. Thing is that we know from Paul's other letters that he himself didn't believe this. But here he's writing to the Roman Church, people he doesn't know, and so he quotes to them what the Jesus community believed at the time to get in good with them. Again, you can read the relevant sections in Ehrman for a fuller account. Let's triangulate this with another remnant of the earliest beliefs of the Jesus community found in Acts. In Acts, the author includes a speech attributed to Peter, the leader of the Jesus movement in the years after his death. God has raised this Jesus to life, and we are all witnesses of it. Exalted to the right hand of God, he has received from the Father the promised Holy Spirit, and has poured out what you now see and hear. Therefore, let all Israel be assured of this. God has made this Jesus, whom you crucified, both Lord and Messiah. In Acts 13:30-34, the author has Paul giving this speech to the synagogue in Antioch. But God raised him up from the dead, and he was seen for many days of them that came up with him from Galilee to Jerusalem, that God hath fulfilled the same unto our children, in that he raised up Jesus, as also it is written in the 2nd Psalm, Thou art my Son, this day have I begotten thee. In Acts 2, the author attributes these words to Peter. Ye men of Israel, hear these words, Jesus of Nazareth, a man approved of God unto you by mighty works and wonders and signs which God did by him in the midst of you, whom God raised up, having loosed the pangs of death, because it was not possible that he should be beholden of it. And here is another section of Acts. This Jesus did God raise up, whereof we are all witnesses, being therefore by the right hand of God exalted. Let all the house of Israel therefore know assuredly that God hath made him both Lord and Christ. Finally, in Acts 5:29-31, the author writes, But Peter and the apostles answered and said, We must obey God rather than men. The God of our fathers raised up Jesus, whom ye slew, hanging him on a tree. Him did God exalt with his right hand to be a prince and a savior, to give repentance to Israel and remission of sins. A reminder here that any good mythical Jesus theory needs to be able to account for why we find these passages in the writings of Paul and the author of Luke and Acts. You can't just throw them away. You need to be able to account for the observable evidence or admit that your theory doesn't account for the observable evidence. And considering that my theory holds that Jesus was an ordinary person who died and his followers later thought he was raised by God to be the Messiah, it's pretty easy for me to account for this theological view of the historical Jesus. Moving on, the next step in the timeline is Paul's theological view of Jesus. Now, Paul's theology is really big, and I want to examine it more in depth in a future time. I'm just going to draw heavily on Ehrman's recent work on how Jesus became God to show that Paul, like his contemporaries, believed in all sorts of magical beings that existed, including angels. Paul's theology sees Jesus as a sort of super angel, this angel who was above all angels, who served Yahweh with such perfection that God gave him a promotion. From Ehrman's book, Paul stated that Christ, unlike the first Adam, came from heaven. When Paul talks about God sending his Son, he appears not to be speaking only metaphorically, like John the Baptist is said to have been sent from God in John 1:6, for example. Instead, God actually sends Christ from the heavenly realm. As he put it in the letter to the Romans, quote, "For what the law could not do, God did, sending his only Son in the likeness of sinful flesh," unquote. It is interesting that Paul uses this term likeness, just as the Philippians poem did when it spoke of Christ coming in the appearance of humans. It is the same Greek word in both places. Did Paul want to avoid saying that Christ actually became human, but that he came only in a human likeness? It is hard to say, but it is clear that Paul does not believe Jesus just appeared out of nowhere the way angels seem to do in the Hebrew Bible. I always wondered why Paul would indicate that Christ had been born from a woman. What other option is there exactly? But the statement makes sense if Paul believed that Christ was a pre-existent angelic being. In that case, it is important to point out that Jesus was born in a human way. He did not simply appear as the angel of the Lord did to Hagar, Abraham, and Moses. Here, in the last days, he actually was born in the likeness of human flesh as a child. Jesus, for Paul, was the angel of the Lord, and so he too was God's wisdom before coming into this world. Thus, Paul can speak of the glory of Christ, who is the likeness of God, 2 Corinthians 4:4. In this passage, Ehrman reviews this idea of an incarnational theology, the idea that Jesus was a pre-existent divine being who became human. And this is the theology that he's able to infer from Paul's writings. From Ehrman. One final point to make about the Philippians poem may have occurred to you already. I've been calling the Christology that it embraces incarnational, since it portrays Jesus as a pre-existent divine being who becomes human. There is obviously an exaltation element in the poem as well, since at Jesus' resurrection, God exalted him to an even higher state than he had been before. In a sense, then, this poem provides us with a transitional Christology, that it combines an incarnational view with an exaltation view. Later authors will move even further from an exaltation Christology, such that Christ will come to be portrayed as being equal with God even before his appearance in the world, in fact, as equal with God for all time. But this is not the view of the Philippians poem. For this beautiful passage is quoted and presumably believed by Paul, Christ was indeed a pre-existent divine being, but he was an angel, or an angel-like being, who only after his act of obedience to the point of death was made God's equal. We're going to need a lot less time for the other theologies because you're probably more familiar with these. Luke and Matthew both have nativities that have Jesus coming into existence as the literal Son of God when he's conceived, although their stories contradict each other on pretty much every point. And the last theology that we're probably mostly all familiar with is the idea that Jesus was co-eternal with Yahweh and had been for all time. We're going to stop there and examine these 5 different theologies, looking again at the timeline of when they appear. In the chart, you can see the word resurrection in a yellow box. There's a second word in a yellow box, baptism. These ideas are both in yellow because they both represent an adoptionist theology. the belief that Jesus was a human who was later adopted by the Jewish God as his son. We can say, based on the observable evidence, that the earliest ideas about Jesus were that he became the Messiah when he was resurrected by God. We've seen those in the texts. The next version is Paul's very interesting theology that Jesus was a pre-existent divine being subservient to Yahweh that became human, was obedient unto death, and was elevated or exalted even higher than before. The next version we see in the timeline is that Jesus, while still being human, became the Messiah at his baptism. In the next iteration, the timeline is moved back again, chronologically, to Jesus' conception. Luke and Matthew try to make Jesus God's literal son by using competing stories about his divine birth. This means Jesus is both divine and human. That new theology is represented by the blue box on the timeline. And then finally, we have the last version of Jesus' nature that we're going to look at today, that being Jesus coexisting from the beginning of time with God and taking on a human form. As we observe, placing these texts within a timeline that runs from the start of the 1st century until the end of the 1st century, we see a systematic shifting of the goalposts. We see that the people closest in time to the events that our theory holds preach that Jesus was a human who was adopted by God as God's son when he was raised from the dead. Over time, people kept pushing that moment of when Jesus became the Son of God back in time, earlier and earlier, until Jesus was co-eternal with God. How do I, as someone who is convinced by the historical Jesus theory, account for the observable evidence? Again, for me, this is pretty easy. Jesus was a dude with a bunch of followers who, after he died, they thought they saw him in visions or appearances. They decided that Jesus had become magic after he died, and they preached that he was made the Messiah when he was resurrected. Later on, people wanted to account for how Jesus could do all this super magic stuff when he was alive, as the stories circulating about him claimed. So the adoption of Jesus was moved up to when he was baptized. However, that still wasn't enough to satisfy the growing Jesus movement, a movement that wanted to know more and more about the life of the man that they were calling the Messiah. To fill this demand in the marketplace, both Luke and Matthew shifted the timeline of when Jesus became magic, and each made up their own version of events to have a miracle put Jesus in Mary's womb and to put him in Bethlehem for his birth so that he could meet various prophecy requirements. Finally, the community of John set down on paper their view that Jesus always had been one with God, always was, always will be, and that Jesus had always been magic. Now, notably, John doesn't bother with a birth narrative because, of course, it was unnecessary to legitimate Jesus' divinity in their eyes. They don't need no stinking Jewish town to make their Messiah. Anyway, I should note here that I'm only reviewing the text and beliefs that are found in the canon scriptures. I am not yet including any of the views of the Gnostics or the Ebionites or anyone else, but when we go on to the next video, we're going to look at those heretical beliefs. In terms of what we're describing here, as a social scientist, when I look at the theologies and I look at the timeline, I'm going to call this an inverse relationship. The closer in time you get to the historical events, the less magic Jesus is. That is to say that the earliest writers put Jesus' messiahship at the very end of Jesus' life. And the later in time you go, the earlier Jesus becomes magic, such that in the very last gospel, Jesus is co-eternal with God. I can account for this with the historical Jesus theory because we can account for this change through the human tendency of exaggeration. Another part of this that I think is very important is the role of non-Jews coming into the Jesus movement after Paul's missionary work over time until they basically outnumbered the Jews in the movement. Pagans in the ancient world were used to humans being adopted by gods. And pagans were also far more comfortable than Jews were with the whole idea of their gods having sex with women and making little demigod babies. And they were totally cool with the idea of people being made into gods. It's called deification. And also importantly for the role of monotheism, by the time the Gospel of John was written, the Jesus followers in John's community had split with the local Jewish community. The religion had really become its own thing. To summarize, why do we see theological statements that say Jesus became the Messiah only at his resurrection or his baptism? Because the stories are based on a human man that people came to view as the Messiah after his death. Why do we observe increasingly grand claims about the divine nature of Jesus as the decades pass? Well, as the decades passed, converts were less Jewish and more pagan, and people tend to exaggerate stories. A modern example, of course, are people who thought that Elvis never died or thought they saw Elvis after his death. Why was the community of John so at odds with the Jewish community when early on the Jesus movement was part of the Jewish community? Well, early on in the movement, Jesus was preached to be the Jewish Messiah, a teaching that was entirely compatible with Judaism. But over time, as the Christian community put an increasing amount of divinity into Jesus, tensions arose between monotheistic Jews and Jesus followers. The tension had created a massive rift between the two religious communities, as we can see from John's Gospel. The tensions in John show us that by this time, Christianity and Judaism were no longer compatible in their theologies, the way they were when the movement started out. Another challenge for mythicists is this. If you think that there was no human being named Jesus, how do you account for the fact that for the first 40 to 50 years of the Jesus movement, the theology stated Jesus was a human who had been adopted by the Jewish God either at his resurrection or his baptism? How do you account for the fact that Jesus becomes progressively more divine over the decades? They purport to be a better explanation of the early Christian community than the historical Jesus theory, but can they name what the first theology was? Professors and historians using techniques of their discipline have been able to sift out earlier passages from later writers. Just as the Aramaic phrases were fossils of an earlier version of the story, the quoting of already common views of Jesus in the early Christian communities that are included both in Paul's writings and in Acts, we can say for certain that over time the understanding of Jesus' divine nature changed from his being completely human to his being completely divine. Our historical Jesus theory states that Jesus was an ordinary person, and so it is completely consistent with the earliest Adoptionist Christologies, those beliefs about Jesus that we've looked at in this video. Them's the facts. These ideas are in Romans and in Acts, and you can't just get rid of them by saying Paul is unreliable or Acts is unreliable. Again, either your mythical Jesus theory accounts for these observations, or it fails to. And I, for one, would like to see mythicist theories put to the test. Alright guys, this has been a long video, so I'm going to wrap it up. Thank you so much for your time and attention. Until next time, I've been Christy and you have been awesome. Have a great day. Bye-bye.